Hello YouTube and welcome back. Today we're going to discuss all kinds of things regarding Avalanche. This is my third build basically for patch 1.1 and it's something that we kind of did a deep dive into. We've been working with some other content creators, sharing ideas back and forth, trying to figure out what's the optimal source of damage for Avalanche, plus maybe any other skills to go along with it. Something that has lots of quality of life, maybe some relevant defenses, how we want to go about min-maxing the character, and we have lots of ideas to share with you here today. So at the very beginning of this, I want to let you know that the two content creators that I'm going to be talking about in particular are Valinov and CursedBoy. I will be linking to both of their videos. One of their videos is up already, but I'll wait for the other one to post their video. So I'm going to be discussing their build planners and the variations that they proposed for how to play Avalanche. Think both of them did a great job and helped me in like brainstorming different combinations of things, bouncing ideas back and forth. And that's really one of the things that I like most about not only Last Epoch or being in the community, but having a platform like twitch.tv and YouTube and being a content creator is like we're willing to share ideas back and forth, and that just, oh my goodness, it's so much fun. Okay, so that's fun. I want to talk a little bit real quick about EHG. So EHG had this skill called Avalanche in the past, and it was technically a skill that you could use. And oh my goodness, they did a wonderful job breathing new life into Avalanche. Instead of being like a kind of mopey skill that's stuck in 2018, it's now just like a wonderful reason to be playing a shaman. I don't want to make fun of shaman anymore. Shaman used to be one of those masteries that's just kind of lagged behind. And I think he's really he's grown up. He's done a little glow up here, and Avalanche is one of the reasons to do that. That said, I'm also impressed how much hype we had around Avalanche and 4,800% effectiveness of added damage. I'm impressed that Avalanche looked so good on paper and had a good skill tree and has good multipliers, and I really do think it has good design as well. But I also don't feel as though it's OP. And I that really surprises me. I wanted Avalanche to be like completely insane, and I've seen some good min-maxed versions of it. I've seen a lot of damage. I've seen tooltip numbers that have 2 million on them. My current tooltip for my build here is about 700k or so, and I think 700k is respectable, but it's not the giga damage that I was expecting for like my variation of the build here. So we'll give EHG a pat on the back for designing a skill that looks so good, gets people hyped up, has big numbers on it, but at the end of the day, I really don't think it's OP. So it's both a good thing and a bad thing from my perspective, because I wanted giga damage considering the previous builds that I played for the 1.1 patch. So we're going to talk about a good handful of things here at the beginning of the video before we jump into masteries and gears and the specifics of what I've been working on for my build. So first things first is cold damage versus physical damage. There have been a couple of variations of Avalanche floating around YouTube. If you've seen those, do you go physical damage? Do you go cold damage? And there's good merit for going both, but we ended up going for the cold version of Avalanche, and I think that's what I would recommend to you as well. So Avalanche has three skill points to take in addition to your normal skill points in order to get to cold damage, but it also just gives you another more multiplier. It's not like a bad thing that you're sad about speccing into. It's 8% more damage per point and a little bit of quality of life from freezer multiplier. So it's nice to have access to those additional modifiers there, even if you don't have plus levels to your skills. So other things that cold damage grants to you is it gives you percent increased damage off of Warcry, which you're oftentimes going to be using in this build. It gives you access to Throne of Ambition, which will be 40% more damage. And then it also gives you access to a couple modifiers a couple sources of flat damage from the Shaman skill tree. There's flat lightning damage in the Shaman skill tree. There's flat cold damage, but there's no flat physical damage in the Shaman skill tree. So just a couple nice things. If you wanted to go for Twisted Heart, then it's essential for you to be cold instead of Phys. And we have some things that I chose to incorporate in my build that give me elemental penetration instead of giving me physical penetration. So for example, just to tease the gear that we're using a Transcriber's Graver unique one-handed sword in her offhand, and it gives us elemental penetration. So those kinds of things, especially Throne of Ambition, but all those other things mixed in, is why we're opting into cold damage here. So physical damage gives you some extra armor shred off of Gathering Storms, if you're using Gathering Storms, and physical damage also gives you access to, 8 or 12% or more damage off of Maelstrom, which has some extra nodes that just got changed in 1.1 patch. So it's not a clear, definitive answer of like this versus that, because Armor Shred's more effective if you're playing a physical damage build as well. But at the end of the day, I think Cold was a good choice for us, and I'm happy with how it worked out there. So I already talked a little bit about Gathering Storm, so let's move on to like fine point 2 about this particular build and our brainstorming, and that is, what is the 5th skill that we're supposed to be using here? So I'd say 5th skill, but it's also kind of 4th skill. I would say that the central point of Avalanche, the starting point of Avalanche, is Warcry Maelstrom Avalanche. So Warcry gives you % increased damage, gives you lots of increased critical strike chance, it procs Maelstroms for you, it gives you invulnerability, it heals you, it cleanses you. Warcry is really, really nice. It's definitely not a skill that I put on every single Primalist build, but I try to, because I really enjoy playing with, particularly like a numlocked Warcry. If you want to, min-max your character more and not numlock it, that's up to you. But I autocast it by holding it down with my finger constantly for 8 hours at a time. So Warcry Maelstrom. Maelstrom gives you Frenzy Haste. It gives you a little way to proc Gathering Storm if you're using Gathering Storm. But it's just a nice thing to have on your character. So Warcry, Maelstrom, Avalanche. What are we doing with the last 2 skills? So one thing that we could do is Gathering Storm. Gathering Storm is a little bit of extra damage, and what's noteworthy about Avalanche is we have a node in here that allows us to generate storm stacks, which is really cool. I'm going to make a whole new video about this, maybe, talking about storm stacks being weaker than I thought they were going to be. I think proccing actual factual storm bolts off of Gathering Storm seems to be a great thing to be doing, especially off of Tornado, for example. Lots of good builds in that category. But using storm stacks, I've been a little bit underwhelmed with the DPS output of this. It does make you a little bit of an auto bomber. It gives you a way of clearing trash monsters and not needing to, spend 40 mana just to kill a trash monster who's been chasing you. But instead, you just have this damage ticking around you all the time off of your Gathering Storm stacks, which is nice. But for a couple variations of the build, as we've played over the past week or so, we've swapped this in, swapped this out, and I definitely do not think that it's essential. It's nice for, proccing ailments, for example, but it's really not doing that much damage in the grand scheme of things, because Avalanche does a ton of damage. Another option is Thorn Totem. Thorn Totem is something that we tried for damage, tried for utility, tried for elemental resistance, but it does a good number of things. Because we're playing a shaman, we'd like to have a 4x1 idol with a chance to proc a Thorn Totem on hit, and it's just a question of, do we also want to spec into it, or do we just want like a mopey Thorn Totem that gets summoned every once in a while so that we can benefit from, if you have a totem active, because there's a bunch of modifiers for shaman and idols that give you benefits of that. So Thorn Totem, it could give you damage off of Upheaval, which is the next thing we're to talk about. It could apply Armor Shred, so you don't need to build Armor Shred on your affixes. It could give you cold damage, % increased cold damage for each totem you have active, which is another idle modifier, which goes up to 100% increased damage or more if you have, different sources of generating totems, or if you have, plus maximum totems off of some other technology. So Thorn Totem definitely pulls its weight as a 5th skill here. Again, if you're opting into it, but I really don't think it's essential. You kind of pick your own flavor of this kind of thing. So the last thing that I wanted to call out for potential, I guess there's 2 more skills for potential inclusions as a 4th or 5th skill. One is Upheaval. Upheaval is kind of interesting because you could use it for utility, you could use it for damage if you want to put up with it. But in terms of utility, first of all, you're going to be stacking attunement because Shaman really pays you off for stacking attunement these days. But the Primal Bulwark node gives you access to +2 armor per attunement per stack, and it stacks up 3 times. So this is like a little piece of automation that you could be having in the background. One note for this is that, if we're speccing into Gathering Storm, it costs 2 or 3 points to make that feel good on the Avalanche skill tree. And then if you're doing Upheaval, it costs 2 points there. So you're definitely paying some kind of cost for including these as 4th or 5th skills on your character. But having some additional flat armor from Upheaval, especially if you're stacking any kind of strength, which gives you % increased armor, and then Throne of Emission gives you more armor on top of that, it's a good foundation for building up a nice tanky character. At least in this regard, because we'll get to the defensive portion of the build later. It didn't feel great, but we'll get there. The other thing that Upheaval could do, just to let you know that we are completely cooked, we were trying Shatter. So Shatter is a sub-skill of Upheaval, and it shatters totems, and it deals spell physical damage. It is real strange, but it also gives you a lot of health because you're actually building attunement and you're getting health per attunement with the node in upheaval. So it's kind of wild. One thing that we ended up not liking about this, and curiously enough, we also tried a frostbite version of this entire setup and we kind of pivoted off it. But one thing that I did not like about using chance to summon a Thorn Totem on hit paired with Avalanche, Upheaval, and Shatter as a source of damage is that when you hit something, the Thorn Totem always spawns immediately next to your character, which means that if you're trying to hit an enemy, 15 feet over there and you're shooting Avalanche on them, the Thorn Totems are still falling next to you. So your Avalanche proccing Upheaval is always happening 15 feet over there, whereas your Thorn Totems are on top of you. So if you want to use that for single target damage, you need to be a melee character. You need to be standing on top of the boss. And it's cool. It's also very, very laggy, but satisfying. But we ended up pivoting off of that. It is spell physical damage. So again, if you wanted to choose between cold or physical, this might be a determining factor between it. You also have low critical strike chance, but we'll get to the critical strike chance portion later. Not yet, later. The last skill that I wanted to call out as a potential fifth option that we are not opting into, but some other people are opting into, is Summon Spriggan. So Summon Spriggan is like a really good source of flat damage. Flat damage is OP because 4,800 effectiveness of added damage on Avalanche's skill tree. And then on Summon Spriggan, we also have flat critical strike chance. So Avalanche itself has +9, which is 14 critical strike chance because everything has a base crit of 5. But it's nice to get even more critical strike chance. In the easiest way possible for all you new players out there, when you're building crit, you basically get as much flat critical strike chance as possible, and then you start worrying about your percent increase crit. That's not necessarily true these days because, we have a new ring, for example, that gives us +2 critical strike chance. It's like, well, do we want to grab every single source of flat crit? Do we want double rings with flat crit on them? The Phantom Grip? Do we also want a Prismatic Gaze? Do we want to give up our helmet slot as well, just to get as much flat crit as possible? No, but you should know about those, and those should be on your mind when you're thinking about your own builds. So we have a lot of percent increased crit from how we're speccing our Warcry, so we like a little bit of extra help to make that happen, especially if we are using something like the Upheaval Shatter, which has low base critical strike chance. There's not much else going on there. But regarding Summon Spriggan, it has very low durability, and even if you're speccing a full attunement and you're trying to play safe, it's just gonna die, When its corpse is on the ground, it's still giving you access to the flat critical strike chance and the crit avoidance and the spell damage. But if it despawns, then you lose all of those benefits, and it's just kind of annoying. So I definitely prefer a non-Summon Spriggan playstyle. The last Spriggan thing regarding here is Spriggan form. So whether you are doing a mana regeneration build or a mana battery build with form swapping, Spriggan form is something that you could either opt into having unspecced on your bar or speccing into it on your bar. Speccing into it gives you a couple options. You could go for plus maximum totems in case you're doing like a totems matter, cold damage per totems, or elemental resistance per totem to fuel an Urzel's Pride mana regeneration thing. Or if you're swapping into Spriggan form, you get a whole bunch of ward when you swap back and forth. Or you just grab all the defensive nodes with the Thorn Shield nodes, and you spam Thorn Shield on yourself when you swap back and forth. So there's interesting things you can do there if you want to have this as a 4th or 5th skill. Again, I want to reiterate, I think Last Epoch, or EHG, did a really good job with Avalanche, because it does great damage. On a budget, it's crazy strong. It looks so good. It hypes you up and makes you want to play it, but I really don't think it's OP, which is wild, right? Totally, in my opinion, wild. So that's regarding the 5th skill. We talked about cold versus Phys. We talked about 4th and 5th skills and options for how to build out the rest of the character. The next thing that I want to talk about is the weapon. And the weapon has a little bit to do with critical strike chance. So we said that the skill tree in Avalanche has this 9 crit already, so that puts you at 14. But what do you want to do on top of that? So you could go for a staff, and that's, by and large what I see most other builds on YouTube and other builds on like letools.com, the build guides, what I see people doing, because a staff makes a lot of sense. You don't need the crit, so just use a staff. You could use a Titan Heart for damage reduction. You could get a whole bunch of flat damage off of the staff, which goes well with a 40 to 100% effectiveness of added damage. And like, it makes a lot of sense. But it still means that you need to build critical strike chance somewhere, or maybe get a blessing for critical strike chance. Like, you have 14 crit. You could go for a Peak of the Mountain helmet, which gives you another 250% increased critical strike chance. But like, you can go War Cry, like you're almost there. But if you're trying to do something with like Shattered Totems as well, then you're kind of missing out. So not everything's free, and we need to think about where are we getting all of our damage from. Another option instead of a staff, which we experimented with for a bit, was a wand plus catalyst. Catalyst was a nice way of getting flat critical strike chance. We get another offhand, so we can put like more stats on the prefix on the offhand, and then we also have our main hand. But with just a wand, we were looking for more flat damage, and we got a little bit cooked with where our flat damage could be coming from. I'll share that variation with you in just a moment. But we wanted to get a nice balance of critical strike chance along with flat damage, and the wand wasn't what we landed on. So what that brings us to is a new addition to Last Epoch, and I love when like my builds get to showcase something that's new that just got added to the game, and that is the new Nemesis Scepter. So this is called a Scorned Scepter, specifically an Avenged Scorned Scepter. So when you upgrade it by killing a Harbinger while having it equipped, you get the plus 20 spell damage. So the most interesting part about this is I think it's a pretty balanced item. Maybe not, but I think it's a pretty balanced item. It has 9 spell critical strike chance, which is absolutely absurd. It's a ton of damage. But it only has plus 20 spell damage. Compare that to a normal high-end scepter. A normal high-end scepter has like 65 flat damage on it, but it has no spell critical strike chance. So this thing is pretty rare. If I wanted to farm one from scratch, I would expect like 3 or 4 hours worth of dedicated farming for it. I don't know if that's accurate, but that's what I would expect. So this one took us about 2 hours to get. And they are maybe too rare, EHD. We'll see. But a cool addition to the game, nevertheless, having just more options for flat critical strike chance. Mine is not particularly good. It has elemental damage, which is doo-doo. It has the -3 mana cost, which I think is essential for Avalanche because mana is such an issue, and then a little bit of cold penetration as a suffix there. Noteworthy that scepters also get access to flat spell damage. It's lightning, but all damage is good damage, so having some kind of extra flat damage there is nice. So that brings us to our offhand. What could we do for our offhand? This kind of segues nicely into the next part of the conversation, which is where does the flat damage come from? If you're using a staff, it's your staff. If you're cold damage, you take the cold damage nodes. If you're shaman, you get the shaman nodes, the Rune of Awe, and your mastery. And that's a nice thing to have. So where does your flat damage come from? For us, we tried to answer this question by using an offhand. One of the build planners I'm going to share with you comes from CursedBoy on YouTube. So he ended up using a Polaris, and a Polaris gives you 1 flat spell damage per 2 strength. So that, combined with LP, getting tier 7 spell damage on it, is a great way to get some extra spell damage onto your character. I ended up going with the Transcriber's Graver, first of all, because I have it, but second of all, because not only does it have the flat spell damage, which is comparable if you have about 40 or 50 strength. If you have more than that, then of course Polaris ends up being better. But it also has elemental penetration. And having a source of elemental penetration that isn't reliant on a cold shred blessing. Remember, cold shred has diminished effectiveness against bosses. So if you're trying to balance out your offense and defense, I wanted to have % increased armor here and have the penetration as an affix on the transcribers. So I think this is a great option for trying to get some extra flat damage and penetration because we're playing cold damage version of Avalanche as opposed to the physical damage. So that's what we were opting into, trying to get our flat damage. What's the most cooked idea that we came up with? It came from someone in chat, as most cooked ideas come from. I guess where they come from. We had a Marinas in our main hand. A Marinas, of course, is necrotic damage, and it has like a bunch of flat necrotic damage. Explicit has flat necrotic damage, got % increased spell damage and cast speed on it, but it lowers your maximum health. And then combining that with a Confluence of Fate, which has like 45-ish flat damage on it, it increases fire damage taken, increased necrotic damage taken, increased void damage taken, but it do have a lot of damage on it. So that's an interesting way of getting more flat damage into your build if you don't mind those little penalties stacked on it as well. If you're playing in Merchant's Guild, go buy yourself a 3 or 4 LP one of these. But if you're playing in a COF, maybe you get a 2 LP. I don't know. I have like 1 2 LP sitting around somewhere, but that's about it. So those are ideas for flat damage. We talked a little bit about like what our body armor was going to be. Oh no, actually we didn't. We didn't talk about our body armor was going to be. But when dealing with flat damage, we did float this item around because getting a bunch of lightning resistance, some tier 7 lightning res, some tier 6 elemental res, and also tier 6 dexterity. You know, if you're already building that much resistance and we get res for our shaman passive and we get res for our protective circle and we're building things like this, we might be able to take advantage of that with something like Morning Frost, which might sound cooked, and it definitely is. But when you have 4,800% effectiveness of added damage, all of a sudden, extremely memey items like this kinda sorta look interesting, and you need to at least consider them. I think Avalanche is a sweet skill. So let's use that as a segue real quickly to talk about which body armor we're using. Of course, we'll cover this again when we get to the gearing section of the video, but just real quick. I think there's realistically 3 different body armors, and I've seen different people opting into different ones of these, which is great because I like having more than just one option. In the past, I would have said, you know, go staff, go Titan Heart, because Titan Heart has the word damage reduction on it, and that's the end of the story because damage reduction is king, and it really is. But for the majority of my character's existence, I ended up using a Null Portent. And a Null Portent is a brand new item that is a little bit misunderstood. So let's make sure that we can hover over this real quick so you see what it does. It has less damage taken per 2 resistance above the normal cap. But, media literacy, it is per resistance. So what this means is you would want to have all of your resistances be 115. And then you would have 20% damage reduction against each of those separate resistances. So taking a look at like what these items offer to you, Null Portent has some percent increased life, and then it has Leech, which is great, and 20% less damage taken. The second body armor, which I think is a relevant consideration for a build like this, is something like this, which is a Wall of Nothing. This drops from from Aberoth, the new endgame pinnacle boss, and it's got like 10 to 16% less damage taken. Kind of, because it has chance to take 0 damage when hit. It doesn't offer you mitigation from damage over time, but it offers you another 2,000 or 3,000 ward, which does kind of help you mitigate damage over time. Pairing a Wall of Nothing with a ward-based defense, you'd probably still have at least 2,000 or maybe even 3,000 health, but you could also pair that with something like a Twisted Heart for the cold damage avalanche. So you spam that, you generate even more ward, and of course you'd still want Leech on top of that. Or you could pair that with a life regeneration build. So building up Attunement gives you health regeneration. Building up Strength gives you health regeneration, the Beastmaster skill tree. And then you would have a health regeneration blessing feeding into a Vessel of Strife. And of course, a Vessel of Strife changes, or there we go. Percentage of health regeneration also applies to ward. So this is an option for like how you would make use of that that Wall of Nothing as like a secondary or a second option for what to use for your body armor. The third option, of course, is the one that we currently have equipped, which is Urzel's Pride. So Urzel's Pride has some relevant text on it. It's got armor, flat armor, strength. Strength helps all sorts of things, including the percent increased armor, but it also helps mana or health regeneration if you're trying to include that in the build as well. But we're a shaman. We get extra elemental resistances while we have a totem active, and we can have elemental resistance per active totem, which kind of makes us want to spec into Thorn Totem. So there's lots of moving pieces for how to put together a build like this. So that's neat. Let's talk about one last thing here, and that is how to deal with mana. So the mana is the one thing that feels the most clunky about Avalanche. So it costs, 50 mana. You can spend points into -8 mana cost. You can have -3 up to -5 on one of your weapons for reducing the mana cost even more. You can build a whole bunch of mana regeneration. You can have mana regeneration per active totem. Let's see, what's our... We're at 28 mana regeneration right here. It's not mana regen per totem, but it's elemental resistance per totem, and then that transfers into mana regen from the Urza's Pride. So you could go for a mana regen route, but the other option, of course, is using form swapping. So for those of you who haven't seen this before, your option here is to guzzle your mana as quickly as possible. Something along these lines, holding down right click, and then boop, we're going to swap into our Spriggan form. And I'm going to keep holding down Q with my pinky so that when it's off cooldown, I just immediately turn back into a human. So that is this option. If we're speccing into Spriggan form, it gives you more options for like generating ward off of that or casting Thorn Shield on yourself. But realistically, you're just using it because it shoots you back up to your maximum mana. So whether you're building a mana regeneration build or a form swapping build, you definitely want like at least 500 flat mana. So if you're playing mana regen, I suspect that about 35 mana regen would allow you to play comfortably without doing any form swapping at all, because at some point you're going to walk around and avoid stuff. But if you're playing a Spriggan form build as well, instead of building mana regeneration, I would heavily encourage you to get both cooldown recovery speed on your boots and cooldown recovery speed on your belt, because spending as little time in the Spriggan form as possible is going to really help you maximize your DPS and feel like it's a better playstyle overall. So 500 mana either way, either 35 mana regen if you're going mana regen route, or cooldown on both pieces of gear, belt and boots, if you're going for the form swapping route, is my recommendation to you. So in the build planners that I recommend to you, not only mine, but also from other content creators, you'll see that one, well, actually, let's go pull this up real quick. So you'll see that one build planner is going to have, oh, let's see, do I have these pulled up? I do have these pulled up. One build planner is going to be from CursedBoy, and he ended up going the mana regeneration route. You see is about like 27 mana regeneration here, but he gets more mana regen when he has a totem active, and of course he's playing an Urza's Pride variation. So that's one option for you. So he's not doing anything with form swapping, no Spriggan form at all. And then the other option is something that looks a bit more like this. So this is the one that Valinov has been working on. I don't think this is his like perfect finished product, but it's the most recent one, and then I will have a link to his video as well, because I know they're both publishing videos on this build. So he went for a ward-based defense, Wall of Nothing plus Twisted Heart, which is one of the things we talked about. And then he has cooldown recovery speed plus Spriggan form. And when he swaps into his Spriggan form, he gains a bunch of ward. He's casting his Thorn Shield on himself. His Thorn Shield's a cold spell. He generates more ward off that. And because he has cooldown recovery speed on his belt and on his boots, it means that he's able to swap between those two forms and get a bunch of defense. Why is that relevant to you? It's relevant to you because the defense of this build is suspicious. I do not love the defense of this build. I know I'm dual wielding. Being a staff-based build would mitigate dual wielding, because for some reason in Last Epoch, when you dual wield, not only do you give up the option of using a shield, but you also get automatically punished for dual wielding. I would love if this weren't the case. It's garbage and I hate it. But maybe that's the reason that I feel so squishy. Maybe. It could also be that we don't really have that many sources of DR in the build, but it's one of the things. For our particular build, we're using 2 red rings of Atlaria. So these are crazy. And remember, in Circle of Fortune, these are actually pretty easy to farm. If you're playing in Merchant's Guild, I guess go buy them. I don't know what Merchant's Guild does. Just go farm something or find an exploit. But in COF, it's relatively deterministic to get this. You just do ring prophecies, and at some point, you'll be finding these things. So they take some grinding, but they're basically about as deterministic as they can be. Maybe even too easy to farm. So we have double red ring and some armor. I have not as much armor mitigation as I want for my gloves, but remember, in 1.1, we have 2 relevant helmets that you ought to know about that you should consider for every single build, whether you use them or not, but you should consider them. One is Snowblind. Snowblind has 2 separate more armor multipliers, which is amazing because it helps with, what do you call it? The armor mitigation applies to damage over time. So that is on a per enemy basis, but it does filter in. So that's really nice. The other option is a Decayed Skull. And again, whether you use these things or not, they should definitely be on your radar. And Decayed Skull is more armor, which is great because it even goes with like more armor from Throne of Ambition, but then it has that armor mitigation also applies to damage over time. So those are helmets that you need to know about, whether you use them or not, because they just recently changed and you might not know about those changes. So I don't really like the defense of my build. For the two other content creators, CursedBoy was doing the Urzel's Pride variation. It sounds like he and I have both been doing about 800 corruption. I die periodically, which makes me very sad. I think he could get more defense on his gear because he's playing Immersion's Guild, so his gear is a bit better than mine. But I don't know, something about this build like doesn't look great in terms of defense, even though the damage is looking good. On the other hand, Valinov's build, which I'll hover real quick showing you this, is this Wall of Nothing plus Twisted Heart build. I know his builds have a little bit clunkiness built into them. I think he's working on trying to remove Summon Spriggan, which I love not using Summon Spriggan, so more power to him for that. But the form swapping is something that I want to highlight, because form swapping in and out of Spriggan form, building cooldown and recovery speed and everything. Remember, when you are in Spriggan form, you are using cast speed to cast these Thorn Shields on yourselves, and Thorn Shields give you armor. So the cast speed and the cooldown are very, very important for what Valinov is doing here. He is guzzling his mana, turning into a Spriggan, getting a bunch of getting a bunch of armor based on these nodes, like literally 20,000 armor, and then he swaps back into a human. When he's a human, he has 15,000 warders or 15,000 armor or so. He uses his cast speed, he dumps his mana as fast as possible, and because he has cooldown recovery speed, when he swaps back into being a Spriggan form, he gets to take advantage of Leaf Barrier, and the Leaf Barrier armor gained as ward is fueled by his previous conversion, like, from one rotation ago. So this is a really good way of generating ward, and his defenses, between the three of our builds, his defenses definitely look the best. So power to him. We will be linking all those in the description of the video as a reminder. So those are a lot of talking points. I love making YouTube chapters. Please, please, please use YouTube chapters to jump around. Let's go over this build here. Again, before we do like gear, mastery, all that stuff, that just like highlighting what we did with this variation of the build. Again, shout out to EHG for making a skill that looked awesome, is good. I really don't think it's OP. It has lots and lots and lots of moving pieces in it. I think the only criticism, which is a completely fair criticism, I haven't seen anyone use the nodes on the left side of the skill tree. And I think the nodes on the left side of the skill tree are there as an homage to what Avalanche was before patch 1.1. Just in case somebody still wants to play it. I don't see anyone using it, and I don't know why you would use it. In addition, this node with the EQ stuff, Avalanche is like a big mana skill. And EQ is the other enormous mana cost skill. And having two enormous mana cost skills proc each other, if you can show me a build that uses this node, and like, I don't know, and in any capacity, if you can use this node in any capacity, I would love to see that build planner or even like a clip of it in action. Because I think this whole side of the skill tree should be like snipped and deleted and replaced with something else. This node in particular, I can't imagine what EHD was thinking by putting this node here. That said, let's go through skills, masteries, and gear and show you what my variation of this build looked like. Skills first, Gathering Storm. Gathering Storm was something that we added into the build and took out of the build periodically. I don't love it. You could replace it with something else like we talked about previously, but I'll show you what I'm doing here. So Gathering Storm, we're converting it to cold because we have a lot of elemental penetration and more cold damage with our Throne of Ambition idol. We are taking some extra stun stuff on the very bottom right, and then we're taking all the nodes on the left side because we can. Remember, most of the time, if you're playing like Tornado Gathering Storm, you're not generating storm stacks. You're only using storm bolts. Avalanche is different because it actually generates storm stacks, which I think is actually worse, but more on that later. So we can have these nodes like chance to gain storm stacks. Against single target, you'll gain like 45 storm stacks, and then you'll have to wait for another minute for all of those to be consumed. But that's a different story. One thing to note about Gathering Storm is the stun stuff, especially like Maelstrom gives us stun chance per stack, and then Gathering Storm also gives us stun stuff here. Stun stuff looks really good, and it is really good. However, if you're farming tier 4 Julra, it's miserable because it completely messes up like the action queue of what skill she's going to use. And instead of being like an extremely easy, predictable fight, she uses like 3 skills at the same times in all different directions, and it becomes a chaotic mess. Like, this build should be like the easiest thing in the world when it comes to tier 4 Julra, but because we have so much stun chance, it kind of messes up what skills she's trying to use at what point in time. Stun is not OP. Consider taking it out. Next up is Avalanche. We showed this skill previously, but we have all the more multipliers, -1 point in Dead of Winter, because we want to have 4 points for minus mana cost, and 2 points with storm stacks. If you wanted to do upheaval or one of those other variations that we talked about, you'd have to make your own adjustments. Things that we tried and ultimately did not use were these nodes on the top right, Shatter Shot. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. For 5 points, you get 30% more damage, and then doubled 60% more damage against frozen enemies. So this is a good option if you have a ton of extra points to use, but we ended up not doing it because I wanted the minus mana cost instead. On the very bottom right of the skill tree, we have the Snowstorm, which I think is an underappreciated node. I don't see many people using this, but I think it's really good. So we have this node here that says small boulders have a chance to be replaced by large boulders, and having something like this, drops additional small boulders like 1, 2, 3. Each of those is a 20% chance to be a large boulder, and when a large boulder crits, it drops more small boulders. I think these nodes are actually quite strong, and if I weren't doing the cold variant here with the extra 4 skill points, I would go 1, 2, 3, 4, and then maybe just drop like one of these 2 points in the bottom and pick this node up instead, because I think these nodes are actually quite strong. I think they're underexplored. Warcry, if you've seen it once, you've seen it every single time. So we have a half cooldown, or like 5-second cooldown for Warcry. We have all the crit on the top, all the crit on the left side, some percent increased cold damage, and we're proccing as many Maelstroms as possible. Proccing Maelstroms is nice because Gathering Storm gives us crit chance per Maelstrom, so that gives us flat crit on that thing, making sure that it crits all the time. We also have some cleanse and some life gain. In Maelstrom, again, it's very boring skill tree. Everything on the top is Frenzy Haste. We have some stack duration, some storm bolts. Remember, these storm bolts are fueled by the Gathering Storm skill tree, and some what do you call it? The stun chance per stack over here. Something that we should mention real briefly is the fact that in Gathering Storm we're not using excited bolts, and I think that's really important. We're using all of our mana in order to fuel our Avalanche, because Avalanche deals a ton of damage. On the other hand, we talked about like Avalanche not being OP. And one of the reasons that I say that is that, Avalanche, it does do a lot of damage, but it's definitely not unfair damage, which is weird because I've seen like 2 million tooltips and I've seen really high damage. I still don't think it's unfair damage, considering what other skills in the game do. If this were like peak, great. That'd be great. The fact that we're using all of our mana for Avalanche means that we can't use excited bolts in the Gathering Storm skill tree, which means we can't use Tornado or something. So an earlier iteration of this build was kind of erring toward like Tornado, Gathering Storm, Storm procs, whether it's going to be Frostbite or spell damage. But like that's an established build, and you can play like Tornado, Werebear, Druid, Lightning, Rampage stuff, and it's very, very good. It was like the fastest build to level 100. In patch 1.1, like it's a crazy good build. Doing this even as a shaman, I think the most popular shaman builds right now are Tornado, proccing, Gathering Storm, using the storm bolts, specifically using excited bolts, because you can proc all these storm bolts at the same time and then do something to manage your mana. And I still think that that's going to be the standout #1 shaman build, which is kind of disappointing because for a big mana cost skill like Avalanche, it's 4,800% effectiveness of added damage. Why is it not dealing as much damage as like an excited bolt, Gathering Storm, Tornado build? I don't know, but yeah, definitely not OP. In any case, I digress. Let's talk about our last skill here. Thorn Totem. Remember, we're specing into Thorn Totem because we have Ursul's Pride. So we have plus maximum totems all the way across the top, and then some extra armor shred and cast speed. That's really all we're taking here. For our mastery, with 20 points into Primalist, As a life-based build, I wish that I could pick up Cornered Beast, but I'm feeling a bit stretched for all the nodes that I want to be using. So I have some strength, some attunement, and some percent increased life. And again, we're dual wielding, so we need that 1 point there. If I could pick up Cornered Beast as well, I would, but I'm currently level 96, and I'm just picking up other things instead. In Beastmaster, we have 8 points for DR and 2 points in Aspect of the Boar. At least 1 point I would call mandatory. I like 2 points here, but we're not picking up anything else. If you're a health regeneration build, of course, you know about natural fortitude already. In Druid, we have the best node in the whole game. Man, I love this node so much. Strength attunement per point with a 5-point threshold for all attributes. It's just, it's the best. Noteworthy, you'll see some variations in the builds you pull up on anywhere that you look for builds. Some people opt into these nodes at the top for the 4% health leech on crit, and then crafting your crit and using this for health leech, and then getting the extra attack and cast speed as well. I ended up using this because this is my primary source of leech. But if you were using something else, like a bleeding heart, for example, you could trim these points and then just like not have 8 points, 8, 9, 10, 11, 11-ish points in the druid tree that you don't need to be specing into. So that's if you have a different source of leech. But everything's an opportunity cost. If you're using a bleeding heart, you're not using a nihilist. If you're using the leech blessing, then you're not using a crit multi or crit chance blessing. It's so many moving pieces. I love it. The rest of the mastery, let's look at the shaman skill tree here. We have everything that has the word attunement on it, which is pretty important. So we have attunement penetration. We have our totem cast speed stuff. We have 1 point into Tempest form. Earlier on, I had 8 points in this, but I started moving those points around, looking for different sources of damage and DR instead. But, it's an option, especially if you're looking for flat damage with Ligonian Wrath. These are different things we had in different variations of the build. We're playing a cold damage build, and I want as much flat as possible. So we're spending 7 points to get Shattered Heavens. And then we're a attunement stacking build, and attunement gives us mana, which is important because we want a big mana pool. It gives us health regeneration off of the top node here, Ironbark. It gives us mana regeneration off of elemental shrines, and it even gives us stun avoidance, which is non-zero. So I'm happy to have this kind of thing in the build. I do wish that we had like one more thing, maybe even 2 more things that skilled off attunement. I kind of want to take this node, or sorry, what is it? This node? I kind of sort of want to like pick up this node, and, take it out of druid and put it in shaman instead. Or maybe just like move it below the halfway point so that I could spec into it if I wanted to like kind of stretch myself to it, because that would, maybe make you not spend these extra points here. And maybe, I don't know. I like opportunity costs, and putting this node below the halfway point definitely looks super enticing. So I think you'd see shaman builds try to stretch even thinner, and I would call that a good thing. I like questions like that. At the top of the skill tree, if you're an Urza's Pride build, you're taking the Protective Circle, flat damage, mana regen, and like we just mentioned, Iron Bark. Let's take a look at our gear here and see what kind of choices we were coming up with. We have our defenses with Red Ring of Valeria. Remember, I still felt squishy, and we talked about defensive variations in a previous segment of the video, so we're going to skip over that. For a helmet, we talked about 2 other helmets for unique helmets. If you're trying to min-max your character, I suspect that you're using one of those 2. But as an alternative, this one, the Ancestral Crown, it has endurance. And when you have when you're trying to like min-max, I feel like people worry too much about the max and not enough about the min. I see a lot of build maxing, but it's so seldomly that you see like build minning. And that's like, trim all the fat out of your build and try to have as many useful affixes as possible. Like on my relic down here, I've got 2 garbage suffixes. Like, this is not min-max. This is completely wasteful. This could be so much better. But having something like endurance as an implicit on your helmet, and even that percentage of health gain as extra maximum endurance threshold, this is a very, very good helmet base. It just happens not to be, a snowblind or a decayed skull like we talked about previously, but I think it's an appropriate endgame base, so I'm happy enough to have it here. For our amulets, I've been using these nihilists because I have a whole bunch of them. I would only use one that has positive stats and +2. Mine has less armor, but c'est la vie. So yeah, I think nihilist is amazing. The other things that you might be looking for are like, I guess you can use an Aurora's Time Glass. I guess you could use an Ominous. But realistically, the other things that I might consider would just be a Bleeding Heart in order to have some source of extra leech in my build. All right, so we talked about a Scepter previously in the video. We're using this one with 9 flat critical strike chance. Mine's garbage. Like I said previously, I think if you wanted to farm one of these, you would expect to spend like maybe 3, maybe 4 hours of dedicated farming. I suspect that they're not as common as they should be, EHG, for how many variables it goes into just finding one and then having good stats on it. It takes a lot of effort. So yeah, maybe it could be a bit more common, but it is interesting having an additional source of flat spell critical strike chance. So I like that it's in the game. It's just a pain in the butt to farm. We talked about the offhand when we talked about sources of flat damage. You're either using this or a Polaris offhanded sword because you're looking for some kind of unique that has spell damage or a way to change strength into flat damage in the case of the Polaris one-handed sword. But we're using this one because it has an elemental penetration suffix on it. For our belt, I really think that if you're going for a Urzel's Pride route, you probably want some extra mana regeneration as well. Because like I said previously, my mana regen with our totems up ends up being about 26 or 27%. I get 28% mana regeneration there. But I don't have mana regen anywhere. So like having some kind of mana regeneration prefix would be great. And then for suffixes, you'd like to have health. But, you know, if you're playing a form swapping build with something like Spriggan Form, especially if you're doing that ward stuff as well, you know, Wall of Nothing, Twisted Heart, or maybe even a life regeneration variation. The utility of having extra cooldown recovery speed on your belt skyrockets. So again, it's like which variation of the build do you want to do. But man, I do love the opportunity cost. Like you want health. You really want that cooldown recovery speed as well. And you also need to do something about critical strike avoidance. So like, do you want to be a Citadel boot build, getting the reduced bonus damage taken from critical strikes? Do you want to have sealed fortify, sealed reduced crits on your boots? Do you want sealed reduced crits on your gloves? Do you want to have something else sealed instead? You could have sealed this, or you could have sealed, percent or 3% or tier 3 hybrid health. It's so much. It's so much. And the build's kind of mid. No, I didn't say that. The build's kind of mid. Okay, so let's talk about gloves. I think there's two options for what you'd be doing here for gloves. One would be like an Eternal Gauntlet like this that also has armor mitigation applies to dot on it, either as a prefix or as a sealed modifier. Remember, you can use Glyph of Insight to force that. Otherwise, you need to farm a bunch of exiled mages to get it to drop. But mine happens to have crit chance and cast speed. I'd like to have cast speed and attunement, or just like attunement and strength. But this is the best thing that I had sitting around because I don't have a good pair of Eternal Gauntlets that I could be using otherwise. But as a generic pair of gloves, I guess this one's fine. It's double exalted. But man, damage over time is absolutely brutal in Last Epoch right now. And even at 800 corruption, like we have our double red rings, which makes you look like I'm really tanky. But double red rings, even using a null portent instead of using an Urzel's Pride, you just get blasted by damage over time. So having as much of this stat as possible, or making YouTube videos and begging EHG to add in more sources of damage over time mitigation, one of those two things is a good choice. I'm not going to tell you which one, but one of those two things is a good choice. For our boots, I think there's two options for us. The first is a crit mitigation affix, or the implicit with reduced bonus damage taken from crits, which is the Citadel boot. The other option is one that we saw. Can I pull this up again? The other option is the one that we saw Valinov using in his build, which is the Foot of the Mountain. It gives us -6 mana cost while standing still, so it helps you against bosses, for example. But if you're using this, you really want 1 LP for movement speed, because it has no movement speed on it. But you also want it with 2 LP, because you want attunement on it as well. But you also want it with 3 LP, because you want cooldown recovery speed as well. So if I had a 3 LP, I'd be just like the happiest dude on earth, because 3 LP with attunement, movement speed, cooldown, recovery speed sounds insane until you realize that you really want 4 LP because you'd love to have hybrid health on it as well. So I'm not going to tell you how to live your life or farm these for the rest of your life, but man, having a 4 LP Foot of the Mountain would be absolutely insane, wouldn't it? Because boots are just such a high priority these days. They do so much, like the Citadel boot. The day that we get a unique pair of boots that is a Citadel boot, do we? I don't think we do. I'd have to fact check that because I know we have the Fiery Dragon shoe, which is kind of sort of the same. But man, like if we ever get a unique boot that's like a Citadel boot, it's going to be a game changer. For our relic, we talked about 3 different options. We have something like this, which has damage leeches health on hits, another source of leech for a build like me that want as much leech as possible. Another option would be a Twisted Heart with either, cast speed, plus levels to Avalanche, attunement, or strength. One of those 4 things would be excellent for you. or using a Vessel of Strife. Vessel of Strife would be like your health regeneration build, where you'd spec into Beastmaster for the extra health regeneration for strength stuff there. So those are the kinds of things that you'd be looking for on your relic. For our idols, the most important thing that we need is this chance to summon a Thorn Totem on hit. We love for the second affix here to be cold damage per active totem. This gives you like at least 100-ish% increased damage depending on the roll, and then depending on how many totems you have active at any given point in time. So the prefix modifier on this, the chance to summon a Thorn Totem on hit, is the most important. Everything else is fluff. You could have opt into Throne of Ambition. You could opt into a handful of hybrid life idols with the percent health and then the suffix of flat health. You could opt into 2 of these to have, 100 times 2, 200% increased cold damage per active, or not per active, but total increased damage. So there's a couple options for how you might opt into these, but yeah, just like something like Throne of Ambition or flat health, but the most important one is just the chance to summon a Thorn Totem on hit. Let's look at blessings real quick. Remember, you can swap blessings these days, which is insane. And I absolutely love that we're now able to do this. So I'm going to load that up while we take a look at blessings. Hopefully without crashing in game here. So what are we doing? I would say there's like one blessing that really matters, but I think there's a lot of blessings that really matter. So unfortunately, there's going to be a lot of stuff to discuss regarding blessings. So for our Black Sun blessing, normally I'd say like Crit Multi or Spell Leech. But like for my build, I would love to have percent increased critical strike chance as a prefix somewhere. Like I don't want it on my relic because I want attunement and I want plus levels. But like increased critical strike chance or like spell crit on a Nihilus, on like a amulet would be nice. On a weapon would be a nice source of increased critical strike chance as well. So it's definitely a failing of my particular build that I need this extra critical strike chance here. So ideally you just have Leech in this place. And then if you got a Leech, then maybe you're also trimming these and putting those points from the Druid skill tree somewhere else. But let's pull this back up. For our Lagan blessing, Lagan has 3 very relevant blessings for us. First is percent increased cold damage. The second is mana, because whether you're going for form swapping or mana regeneration, you'd like to have a big mana pool to make use of your Avalanche. And the third is, well, if you're going for a regeneration thing, using like Wall of Nothing plus Vessel of Strife, then you'd like to have the Regen Blessing, which just got buffed in patch 1.0, and the Regen Blessing is really, really strong for Vessel of Strife builds. The next one here is like whether you want to go crit avoidance or whether you want to go for extra elemental resistance. Elemental resistance from a blessing combined with all res on Red Ring of Valeria and all res from Annihilus really does a good job of fueling a Null Portent. Because remember, Null Portent wants you to have 115 total resistance for taking advantage of the 20% less damage taken off of this thing. Let's put that in my inventory so I don't need to swap around anymore. So that's an option there. If you wanted to go for a like either a boot swap or like permanently full-time being a Foot of the Mountain build. Foot of the Mountain is the one that has the minus mana cost while standing still that we showed previously. Well, then you don't have the implicit modifier of reduced bonus damage taken from crits. So if you're going for Foot of the Mountain, I think you end up going for critical strike avoidance. Otherwise, you just go for all res on this blessing. Next up is whether you want to go for percent increased armor or Cold Shred. Cold Shred is not as effective against bosses. If you take a look in the in-game guide, resistance shred, where does it say? Subtract 5% resistance against most mobs, but only 2% against players and bosses. So it has reduced effectiveness against bosses there. Having some source of penetration, like the transcribers, for example, I think this is a really good choice and even competes well with using a Polaris because of that. So do you want to do this and also have extra damage from Cold Shred? Do you want to do this and then have percent armor instead? That's kind of up to you. But I think the most universal one that you definitely want is the flat armor, because there's nothing else that really competes there, and having a big source of flat armor feels great. That's a lot of talking. This video is kind of front-loaded in the information and like the kinds of stuff we want to talk about. But what's that mean? It means that this video is like a deep dive into Avalanche. We tried a lot of stuff. We tried frostbite stuff. We tried tornado stuff. We tried storm bolts. We tried like being a minion build, like incorporating thorn totems in different capacities. We tried using all kinds of different things, and this is what we ended up on. We were collaborating with not only Twitch chat but also other content creators while they were making their videos at the same time, and I love that we're able to do that. So I'm just going to be linking their videos in the description of this video here. So hopefully you're taking a look at their videos as well, because I love what they ended up on for Avalanche. What's the takeaway? The takeaway, like I said at the beginning, I love this skill. It's not OP. It makes me scratch my head. It makes me want to explore all kinds of different things. It makes me want to build plus maximum levels, which I think is like exactly how EHG wants me to feel about a skill. If this is the quality of skill that we get as a reworked skill across, you know, everything in Sentinel, because everything in Sentinel needs a rework as well. If this is the quality of update that we get across the board, we're in for a treat, because that sounds awesome. The left side of the skill tree could probably be replaced with something else, but that's a different story. If you're watching all the way at the end here, you'll note one very important node. I forgot to mention this previously, but this is a bonus just for you. You'll note that some people have this node, Explosive Impact. And you know what? If you're watching this far, let me go ahead and show you what this node does real quick, because it's definitely a little piece of technology that popped up in like social media. Like people in Discord are talking about it, people in Twitch chat are talking about it, but hopefully it also gets included in the YouTube guides so that you know what the hell is going on. So let me let's go punch a monster real quick, and then I'll respec a node. So this node, it's tricky because it actually does the opposite of what you think it does. It says they fall in a larger area, and each boulder has a larger area of impact. So here's what it looks like. And it makes them all drop in a straight line right on top of the enemy's head. So it's really good for single target damage, because there's no variation at all in their area of effect. They just all fall directly in one straight line, which is obviously insane for single target damage. Without this node, why does this node do the opposite of what it says it does? I don't know. So if we take this node off, it looks a lot more familiar. It becomes like, you know, normal Avalanche, where it falls in a large AoE, hitting all kinds of monsters, like being better for clear speed. Yeah, cool. Why does that exist? I don't know, friends. Don't know the answer to that question. But it literally does the opposite of what it says it does. So that's a little token for you, a little piece of information rewarding you for watching to the very end of the video. I am going to go play a different build, because this build is fair, and I want something bigger. I want something that's like more relevant defense, and there's just so much stuff to explore in patch 1.1 that spending more time here when there's all this stuff to explore, I think is not a good use of time. So we're going to go try something else instead. If you've been playing Avalanche in some capacity, if you're doing the channeled version, if you're doing the EQ version, God, maybe, let me know, because I love to see how people are mixing and matching all these different ideas and finding something that works for them in particular. Remember, in the description of the video, I'll have 2 extra links, one point to CursedBoy, who is doing the Urzel's Pride mana regeneration stuff, and one point into Valinov, who is doing the form swapping, cooldown, recovery speed, ward stuff. So I love their ideas, and I love that they were willing to share their builds with me as well while we were building and brainstorming Avalanche. Whew! It's a good video. Thanks for being here, Chad. I'll see you next time.